Thanks for tuning in, everybody. This is Psychedelics Today. It is Joe, and co-host is Kyle. Today on the show we have Brett Greene of Psymposia, and we get into some really interesting subjects. This is a different kind of event for me to discuss with Brett, and I hope you guys all find it interesting. It seems to really flesh out the whole psychedelic scene and give us a lot more perspectives into what might be going on. Really appreciate Brett's time and willingness to talk to us, and can't wait to talk to him again. Thanks for listening, everybody. Enjoy. Brett Greene, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Our pleasure. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe some things that happened that led you towards what you're doing today with Psymposia?
It's Psymposia. Because our first event was the symposium, I think people still refer to us as the symposium. My background is actually as a musician. When I was 13, I started playing guitar. I was a poet. I started writing and performing music and playing it in the halls of my school. And around that same time, I started reading a lot about psychedelics. I don't know exactly what got me interested, but it could have been a friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine and mentor, who is now a professor at MIT, and he'll remain nameless for this call. You know, I befriended him when I was 9 or 10, and my aunt was one of his roommates, and he was actually a film person, and he had all these film posters around his wall. And so I was very interested in film as well. And so I started asking him questions about all the posters. And long story short, we got to be fast friends. And so my best friend when I was 9 was I think 45, and we've been friends all this time. And so I think my first introduction to the topic of psychedelics was when he showed me a movie. It wasn't a very good movie, but it was Timothy Leary's Dick, which was a neat little introduction to Timothy Leary. And in that movie, I think they later found out that it was fake. He was decapitated on screen and ostensibly had died of cancer, and then his head was removed according to his wishes. He became kind of a quick hero in a way. I'd never taken a psychedelic, and I started getting relatively obsessed with him, and I started reading his books. And really from there, I started playing music, and not too much later, I started to experiment with psychedelics. I think that my experience as a songwriter and somebody who is really rebelling against the conventions of the society that I grew up in, like mid-90s America, where everything was kind of fine. I combined that rebel without a cause with my interest in psychedelics. And by the time 9/11 hit, I was pretty much ready for the dystopia. So I think that my interest in psychedelics, combined with like a sense of performance and activism, was sort of the earliest seed for my involvement with Psymposia, which I feel like while it doesn't combine the music, it does combine like production with activism and really trying to make a splash and make some noise, not always harmonious noise, sometimes disruptive noise in both the psychedelic world and the culture at large. So to answer your question in kind of a long about way, activism, performance, and the desire to disrupt the status quo.
Awesome, cool. So let's go to the genesis of Psymposia. How did it come about? How did you meet the people involved and decide you wanted to do something?
So we, first of all, I went to Psychedemia in 2012, and that was a conference at UPenn that had been put on by a group there that included Nijay Debenot, who is presently teaching at University of Puget Sound in Washington. And so Nijay put on this amazing international psychedelics conference. And I went when I saw in my Facebook feed and just bought the ticket and was there, and it changed my life. I think the thing that struck me most about it was just the community and the fact that I finally found a group of people that I just clicked with, and 9 out of 10 people there really I just clicked with instantly. And I thought, there really is something to this. It was like I found a long lost family that I never knew existed, and so it was such a magical thing that I didn't really know at that time that I wanted to be, organizing. I would ever end up being an organizer, but it was certainly a community that I wanted to stay involved in, and met several people that ended up becoming really essential in Psymposia, including most notably Lex, who's the host of Psymposia now. And me and Lex became very close friends. And the next year I went to Horizons Conference, which had been advertised at Psychedemia. And from there, the year after, I came back to Horizons, and that's where I met who would become the partners of Psymposia. And actually, the genesis of Psymposia really happened in 15 minutes. Dennis McKenna had been speaking at Horizons, and I went up to him and I said, "Hey, I'd love to bring you to Boston and have you do a little book tour with, your book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss." I did have some, contacts at bookstores and whatnot. And then, and 5 minutes later, it had morphed into bringing him to UMass Amherst and having him give a lecture. And then, it morphed once again to, okay, well, who do we know at UMass Amherst? Let's figure it out. And right there and then I had met Brian Viveros and Nathaniel Putnam, and they were both students at UMass. And so I said, "Hey, let's bring Dennis McKenna to Amherst," and they said okay. And it wasn't until maybe 2 days after that we were kind of, it's like when you wake up from the hangover part 3 or something, and it's like, okay, so now I've got this tattoo and this wife, what next? And we had Dennis McKenna, who had agreed to come, and we needed a space, and this evolved into needing a company to be able to take the tickets, and then we needed a website. And so really our company was formed around this one event, and none of us expected that we would continue to do this. We figured it'd be kind of a one-off thing, especially since we almost killed each other when we were doing the first conference that we did. I mean, it was really a trial by fire in a lot of ways, and remarkably, it worked, and it worked really well. And it wasn't that there weren't some serious problems with it. And there were a lot of mistakes, and there were a lot of things, but the audience forgave us. And we kind of found our voice as a group, and part of that voice was in the humility of fucking up and knowing that you're fucking up in front of people that understand you. So it's almost it's almost that we found it and performed kind of trial by fire and gained an identity of just being okay with wherever we're at. And that's what I think people respond to with our events. It's the sense that, we're okay and you're okay, and we don't have to pretend that we're, perfect. And it's funny because it started out with, okay, well, once again, we have technical difficulties with, our audio or our slides. Please excuse us. Obviously coming from the psychedelic place, you all can forgive the fact that we're a bunch of, fuck ups. And I feel like as we gain more professionalism, as we become more experienced with putting on these events, that has sort of morphed from being like, oh, please excuse the fact that we're not professional, to really just being open and being transparent and being at times self-deprecating, but above all wanting to be genuine with our audience and wanting to like really dig into some genuine places.
Yeah, I remember being there, and things got delayed, but I think it was just so exciting that it came together. And yeah, the psychedelic community is really supportive of each other, and I think it's just the excitement to get this stuff out there and support one another and finding each other's voices and sharing it. I had a blast, and it was cool that you guys even incorporated the sound meditation in with the conference. I mean, that's one thing that really stuck out, was having some of this like an experimental thing going on. It was really cool.
Yeah, we really tried to do kind of an everything and the kitchen sink type approach, and some of it worked, and I think some of it didn't. But we were either too stupid to know what we shouldn't try, and so we were able to like kind of try everything with sort of this faux fearlessness, or else we just didn't realize that this was going to be something that we really were building. I mean, none of us really, I would say, until the completion of the second conference, thought that we were actually building something that was going to be like any kind of lasting brand. We just assumed that we were putting on a few events and then we would stop. But we got a lot of demand, and people really responded to what we were doing, and we love doing it, even though there are times when it can be really stressful, and it's kind of it's led us in directions that we never thought we would go, and I really like that about it, actually.
Yeah, it's super exciting to watch you guys grow. And what do you think was like a big thing about the second event? I mean, for me attending, I thought it was really awesome to have the storytelling and inviting some of the the voices that aren't really heard at some of these conferences in to share stories. I believe storytelling is such a powerful way to spread messages, and for some people that have a really powerful story or something that they want to convey, it can be really healing too, to get your voice out there.
Yeah, I think that so the second conference was interesting for a lot of reasons. The first reason I think is that it seemed to capture sort of a zeitgeist at that point in the movement itself, of really wanting to get a little radical and wanting to hear diverse voices already, and not being afraid to put people on stage that had never spoke before. And I feel like not everybody gave a polished talk. Like some, there were people that I thought went, were pretty far out there on the margins, but somehow it worked anyway. And I think it worked because we really aimed at inclusivity at that event. And yeah, you're absolutely right with stories. I think that there's something about a story that sticks with you a lot more than a science lecture. And I think it has to do with like the meaning that is imparted via story. That it's a layer of meaning. You know, we could call it archetypal or, you know, mythological, that isn't really that available like via like a lecture. It's something that can be conveyed through just all of the emotions of the person and the facts of the story, but really also by like you were saying, like the fact that the act of telling a story is also a catharsis for the person there. And it's interesting, like with psychedelic stories, to me, the reason I got into this really is because I find watching people have transformative experiences to be absolutely the greatest high that one can have, you know, and you get a little of that with the psychedelic stories. You know, you see a glimmer of that same transformation that, you know, happens during like a really pivotal peak experience, and some of that gets translated via the stories. And you know, we're also working on some other similar programs that will push that to an even larger extent. But you know, I think that the catharsis that the storyteller gets from telling it, and also that the audience gets from hearing it, kind of aligns in the perfect psychedelic story to really bring everybody back there to that psychedelic experience that kind of got them interested in this whole thing to begin with. And you know, it's really great when that happens.
Yeah, and I gotta say, like, thanks for inviting me down. And that was the first time I've ever shared my story in front of like an audience, and for me to share that was, you know, really powerful and cathartic. But you know, something else that comes to mind when I think about the storytelling and what like Psymposia is a little different than some of these other conferences, that, you know, not a lot of people share their stories at some of the other conferences. And I'm wondering, like, you know, do you think you're taking a risk by kind of letting people share their stories? You know, because, you know, you go to these other conferences and it's mostly very science based, and people are presenting their research and stuff, which is awesome. But yeah, I always wonder, like, have you ever thought about, like, you know, is this kind of taking a risk because it is such a taboo subject in the mainstream culture?
Yeah, I don't know if it's as taboo as it is just like not discussed.
Yeah,
I mean, like, there's a difference between like taboo and not discussed, right? Like, you know, hyenas aren't taboo. We just don't really hear about them that much,
right?
You know, nobody really gives a shit about psychedelics one way or the other in pop culture. Right? I think if you kind of bring it up, like, people sort of have these associations about it, but really, like, at the end of the day, they don't really give a shit. Whereas maybe if you brought it up in like the 80s, then there'd be a lot more negative association with it.
Right.
From some of the, you know, darker chapters of the history. And so that's the first thing. Like, I think that its taboo stature is kind of exaggerated. And, you know, risk, I think the greater risk actually is bringing people up that are just not stable and that haven't really integrated, but, you know, they sort of think that they have, but they're pretty unstable. So bringing them up on stage can just be bad for our image. from purely from like a marketing standpoint. Like, you don't want to have a ton of people that think that they're like the healthiest people on earth, but, you know, people in and outside the community can diagnose them like within minutes.
Right.
You know, so I think that that's kind of more the risk. And Lex is pretty good at, you know, listening to somebody pitch and deciding if it's going to really work for us or not. And I think that one of the criteria that we have is that, what happens to you when you're experienced, like, you can certainly hold that it's true. Just that if it has become kind of dogmatized in your mind and you've taken that to be evidence that you can use to extrapolate other things about reality, whether it's, that aliens definitely exist, or that, that the Queen of England is a reptile, or, I mean, I think I'm fond of this line, and I don't really know where it comes from, but thinking that you're the Messiah isn't the problem. It's when you don't realize that everybody else is too.
Right.
So that's a risk with the stories. Another risk, I guess, with the stories is that really that people don't know how to tell stories anymore. They it's like a dying art form. Not everybody
Definitely.
is a great storyteller, but I think that when everybody's honest, as honest as possible, you can't help but tell a good story.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we tell bad stories is when we're like fabricating. And I don't have any real great evidence for that, but it's just kind of a hunch, and it's what I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
When I really like stories that come straight from the heart, and that allow the person to to reveal something that the audience also reveals, rather than stories that say, oh, well, I had this experience and, I'm special because of it, and, good luck with the rest of you.
So I was hoping to get into, like, I've been to Horizons. I think I went in, like, 2009 in New York. Are they still doing it at the Judson? Is it the Judson Church?
No, they moved. I think now they're in the new school. This past year was at the new school.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
And actually last year was also there one of the days.
So that was like scientists, researchers would go up, people doing interesting therapy stuff would go up and talk about what they've been up to for the past number of years. That seems like a pretty standard format. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it, except it's not very participatory. Sometimes it can get a little boring and you want to take a nap. But how does your stuff really, like, differ? What are you guys trying to do more? Is it like building community, telling stories, not just like talking science? It's like a psychedelic salon type situation.
Yeah. I'll kind of tiptoe around your question.
Sure.
So first of all, Psymposia wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the Horizons Conference. And so I owe the Horizons Conference a debt of gratitude. And, Horizons has also done a lot to, let's say, make psychedelics respectable. But, therein lies the difference, maybe. So we don't believe that it is our responsibility to make psychedelics respectable rather. Just like it wasn't, gay people who were fighting for their rights to be gay, it wasn't their responsibility to make being gay respectable. We believe that we should have the right to use these tools, and that not only is using these tools an activity that can be really helpful in our book and a tool for self-exploration, but it's also a way that we identify ourselves on some level. We consider ourselves psychedelic people. So the idea that we would have to seek out respectability from, let's say, a culture that we don't really respect the values of anyway, seems a little backwards to us. So a lot of researchers who are going after maybe, public funding, who are going after policy change, et cetera, they rely on respectability. And I do not, that's part of their job, is to, go after respectability for this, to change the idea of, that people have about these drugs. That is not our role. We're not going after respectability. We're saying we're here, we're psychedelic, and get used to it. And I think that both things are necessary. So there's certainly room enough in the field for all of us to be doing what we're doing. And, and I think the feeling is mutual. I know that Neil Goldsmith really likes what we're doing. And, we were able to do the Horizons After Party this year in New York, and it was just a fantastic time. And, that party, I feel like, really complemented what Horizons was doing, and vice versa. People look to us to kind of provide that. And, it's great. It's great that both exist. I'm really happy with that kind of coexistence. But I think the difference, if you're asking about the difference is that we don't feel the need to make psychedelics respectable. We think that psychedelics were respectful, they are respectable, and that we have nothing to be ashamed of.
That makes a lot of sense. That's a good way to talk about it. We're people with interesting experiences under our belt, interesting things to say, and why suck up to the other culture if we don't need to, if we're not in a position where we actually need to. When you are part of it and you are doing the research, you're right that it is part of their job to do that. But that's not everybody's job. They do it so that we don't have to, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that all types are needed. Absolutely. And I just want to add, because I think a lot of times it's the elephant in the room with these things. And I'll give a kind of an anecdote caveat to this when I'm done. But despite what everybody thinks, it wasn't the hippies that gave psychedelics the bad rap. It was the CIA. It was people like Ewan Cameron, who I always say Ewan McGregor because it's like the only other Ewan that anyone thinks about. Sorry, Ewan McGregor. But people like Dr. Ewan Cameron, who experimented on people in the most horrific ways against their will with LSD, and the intelligence agencies and the military who attempted to have a viable mind control weapon from LSD, and arguably in some cases may have actually succeeded. It was when they could no longer control what they had created that all hell seemed to break loose with LSD. But I think that while there were certainly some growing pains with LSD in our culture and psychedelics in our culture, had we had a government that accommodated to the presence of these compounds instead of creating this mythology around their eradication, which it's lunatic, we would have seen a very different story. I think we would have seen a continuing of the very positive research that we had in the 50s and early 60s. And, but these are all hypotheticals. Look what else was going on at that time. we had so many upheaval, so much upheaval in that period. So, you know, the only reason I bring up the past at this point is just to suggest that sometimes those who are going after respectability seem to be apologizing way too much for what was really the fault of, I think, in large part, of those who, are arguably more powerful now than they've ever been. And it's an elephant in the room that a lot of people don't want to talk about. But, if you want to point your finger anywhere as to, why psychedelics had some of the negative impacts that they had in our culture, I can't think of anywhere to point it to more than those who, dosed people against their will, dosed arguably entire towns, and we're up to some nefarious tasks with these, very powerful tools that are, by all accounts, amplifiers of the human condition.
Yeah, those are some important points. So you mentioned you were expanding your project a little bit. You mentioned something like Palo Santo. What is that, and where are you going with that?
So Palo Santo is a wood that is used in ceremonies by a lot of indigenous tribes and different shamans, and a lot of times it's used in concert with ayahuasca. But it's a holy wood, and it's burned to really lift the spirit. And Brian Viveros, who's my partner, he was a plant science student, and he had been to South America, and when he was there, he had a very profound experience at Palo Santo, and he thought that it really fit with our wider message and of consciousness expansion and transformation. He started to develop the Palo Santo project around that, and it's, as we say, it's powered by Psymposia. So, it's kind of like an affiliated sub-brand, let's say, under Psymposia, and we've had a lot of success with it at our conferences. People seem to really like it, and there's other projects as well that we're developing. I can't really talk about some of those projects under development, obviously, because they're not real yet, but we're very excited about it.
That's really cool. When is your next one? Do you have the books?
Well, so actually, we have a holiday party on the 18th happening in Brooklyn. Apart from that, we're kind of taking a little hiatus on events right now, mainly because we're in talks for rather than doing these one-off events, we're doing like a slew of them across the country. So our next step is probably doing a tour. So there's that. So definitely stay tuned for events to come. We have different chapters that are pretty active right now. We've got a chapter in Baltimore. We've got a chapter in Brooklyn. We've got a chapter in Montreal, Boston, to a small extent. We have people in Providence, Colorado, and Philadelphia.
By chapter, do you mean like a meetup? They get together and just talk about stuff. Well, or what are they up to?
No, I mean we don't really do the meetup thing. You had said you work for Evolver. I know that Evolver kind of has these what do they call them? Spores, right?
Where they have is like the regional gathering, and then there's just events.
Yeah, I mean
the regional organization, I guess.
Yeah, our model is a little different. Like we'll have people there that put on our events. And then we have arrangements with them, and they sort of more similar, I guess. So I don't know how familiar you are with TEDx, but
one more time, you just broke up for 2 seconds.
I'm sorry.
So you mentioned something about TEDx.
I think the model that we're going for is more of like the TEDx model.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll have kind of active groups that are putting on these events, usually at colleges that are participating around the country and even sometimes outside the country.
That's great because you have people with feet on the ground in all sorts of different places, so you get to hear more about what's going on nationwide and internationally even.
Yeah, for sure. And it's always different. You'll never like step in the same water twice. I mean, that might be true with every kind of event, but it is really neat to see like the differences of the cultures, depending on where we are when we're putting on an event, and the effect that has on like the material that comes out.
Yeah, you guys just had an event up in Montreal in September, and then you guys are just down in you guys just had an event down in Washington D.C. in the Philly, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, the DC event, which unfortunately I couldn't make it, was really, really cool. They took an effigy of the drug war and they burned it on the Washington Mall.
Wow.
And the embers were like a prison cell.
Wow.
So when the fire came out, it revealed like a prison cell in ash. And people gave drug war stories, including Dee Dee Goldsmith, who is the mother who lost her daughter to ecstasy overdose, or I think it was MDMA. And she wants to amend the Rave Act. She gave a really amazing story. Jerry Otero from the Otero from the Drug Policy Alliance gave a really stirring story. It was a really cool time.
Sounds great. Yeah, I wish I could have made it down to some of those, or I wish I could have made it to the one in DC or Philly.
Yeah, the Philly one was really, really a lot of fun. It's really great as well. We had Dennis McKenna, Dimitri Giannis, who he's kind of the Bulgo guy, and just a wonderful human being, and Vijay Devano. And then we kind of did like a little poster session halfway in where we had a lot of graduate students put up posters, and we had like 6 posters there that were really interesting, and it was just like a really nice time. I think everybody there just was really loving it. So the Philly's a great town too. Philly has such like a warm, interesting vibe. And then Dennis and I ended up going to the Mutter Museum, which is like the Museum of Medical Oddities. And it's like Siamese twins and jars and shit. And Dennis was in heaven, and I was like, I gotta get the fuck out of here. It's crazy. I had to thank Dennis for showing me how squeamish I am. I had no idea.
Like only a McKenna could.
Well, yeah, and that mushroom microdose is probably a mistake. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
So you mentioned you were thinking about doing a magazine or creating a magazine. What are you trying to capture in that?
Yeah, so Psymposia magazine is coming out. I think it's February, and it's. I think we're really going after like very interesting stories that are not general information about psychedelics, but rather like kind of these neat little niche stories that kind of capture like weird perspectives on psychedelics and maybe things that nobody really associates with psychedelics. But it will also be a home for, I think, like psychedelic poetry, some neat different video projects, current events, events that capture like conversations that are happening. One of the things that we find is that when we do these conferences, a lot of times like the conversations happening on the sidelines and in the margins are just as interesting as that which is captured. A lot of times the conversations on the margins at these events is really a lot of times just as interesting as the stuff that's captured on camera. So the magazine, to a certain extent, can capture a lot of the stories of people's experiences at these conferences as well, which I think is neat. So we're also going to be kind of taking the pulse of the psychedelic movement as a whole, and looking at things happening within the community, but also trying to kind of relay some of that to like a wider audience at the same time. So we'll see how that works.
Well, that's really cool. So are you calling for submissions for articles or anything, or in talks with people to write for you?
Yep. Yeah, we're looking for submissions. We have an open call right now. There's also some pre-magazine stuff, pre-launch stuff that's already out there. There's like a piece from Dennis. There's a piece from Twig Harper. Uses Fugal salvia. There's quite a few pieces on our site right now. So we'll be calling for submissions now, and then the first issue should be coming out in around February, and it'll be electronic at first.
That's cool. Are you going to be able to like put it on Kindles, or how are you, just on browsers, or?
Yeah, we're going to try to hit as many of like the main platforms as we can. For right now, we're just looking at mainly some of the big ones. I hesitate to say which, because it's not exactly my area.
So I don't know if you heard my last question, but I was wondering, like, you mentioned salvia. Like, are you hearing much about people with interest in salvia these days, or are people doing anything with salvia that you know of?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's plenty of interest in salvia. It seems like people are pretty much split though into like, the camps of I'll never fucking do that shit again. This is like a useful experience. There's definitely, Twig is all about using salvia in the more traditional method, and he has a formulation that
right, like chewing it under the lip for a while, sitting in a chair.
And he has a tincture out or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've tried that, and it's a much slower onset, and it was interesting. I can't say that I would really, be extremely excited to do it again. But whatever works. But yeah, there are definitely people that are interested in salvia. I mean, the people that we've had at our events, Peter Addy was at Yale. I don't know if he's still is, but he studied Salvador, and it's affecting humans, and Twig, who has been using it. Actually, Twig also runs like a flotation place, so he has people float in his place. And, he says lovely things about it. So yeah, I mean, people...
Salvia and floating, you mean?
What's that?
Salvia and floating at the same time?
I'm sure it happens. I think that he doesn't really combine them, but I'm sure,
Yeah, I'm sure some people are doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it could be an interesting one two combined. I have talked to him about it though, and I think he kind of respects the sanctity of each.
Sure. Floating by itself is pretty wonderful. Have you guys done it?
I've never have, no. I keep telling myself I'm going to, because there's a place right down the road. I don't know. I don't know why I never got down there.
The first couple times there's a weird barrier where you have to like kind of just book it. Maybe go with a friend or something if they have two tanks.
Yeah, they do now. Yeah, that's been the plan. I've always planned around bringing somebody and doing it, but I don't know. I
floated maybe 6 times. It's great.
Cool.
Every time it's a good experience. I don't know that you really need to mix drugs in there. You could, but it's pretty awesome already.
Yeah, I mean, the flotation tanks were sort of designed with drugs in mind, so I don't know if the purists really have a ground to stand on. And if you look at
that's true. Like
the earliest proponents of it, or John C. Lilly wrote a whole book about using LSD with flotation tanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great book,
a lot of good stuff has come out of it too. It's not like I mean drugs and floating at the same time. Very interesting research for sure.
Yeah. And I think that anything that takes away some of the distractions from the psychedelic experience is good. And I have problems sometimes with like fibromyalgia and nerve pain and nerve issues, and those issues are really exacerbated a lot of times by psychedelics. The last time I took a really heavy dose of LSD, for example, I experienced serious nerve pain that really became a preoccupation throughout the whole experience. So needless to say, it wasn't pleasant, and I didn't take a lot from it. So anything that can kind of reduce some of that is welcome. And if floating can do that, I'm all for it.
I always wonder about the pains and stuff, if that's something psychosomatic. 'Cause I know in like the early, or like in the 50s and whatnot, they're using it to help treat pain. I believe it had like a pain management property to it in cancer patients, I believe.
Mm-hmm. I think it's dose dependent. It can also certainly exacerbate pain as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've definitely had experiences like that.
I mean, I remember one time I had a significant amount. I was walking with a friend in the cold in New Hampshire, and every inhale I took through my nose felt like somebody was jamming ice picks up. And so I've experienced some pretty nasty tactile hallucinations from LSD.
Well, if it's amplifying that, man, that's got to be pretty brutal.
Yeah.
Just like, it doesn't feel great already, and then you blow it up many orders of magnitude.
Yeah. I mean, it can really, you can fathom hell on that before you saw it. So I hear you. I would say that that leads me to something interesting that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and that is like the motivation that a lot of people have for using psychedelics. I have a friend who is an experienced meditator, and he at times spends entire months doing these meditation retreats. And for him, like when he's taking a psychedelic, he is sort of employing all of his mindfulness techniques. For me, I always kind of regarded that as like, what ends up being your motivation? Is it just like to kind of challenge yourself to see if you can kind of meditate your way out of the trip without being emotionally engaged, or what? Because it seems to almost defeat the purpose. But at the same time, I certainly have had to employ my own mindfulness techniques in order to get through the difficult parts of the trip so that I could glean the lessons of the experience. And so I think it's kind of a thin line between, I guess, preparing oneself for being for being receptive and not being kind of overtaken by some of the negative aspects, whether they be pain or anything else, versus just taking what comes from the experience itself, which also seems like a noble pursuit.
Right. Yeah, something. Well, obviously coming from like a breathwork background, it's been really helpful to kind of use that model of breathing into things and then intensifying it to see what comes out of it instead of I mean, it's a lot harder said than done when you're in the experience and things are flying at you, but yeah, it's been interesting to do a technique like that, to breathe into it, make it bigger and see what's there, try to cause some sort of cathartic experience.
And what's funny is that I know Kyle and I know some of the, well, I think everybody on this call knows some of the same breathwork practitioners, and a lot of times when I've heard from breathwork practitioners, well, if you see that monster, like, go closer to it, like, say what's up and check it out. A part of me thinks, like, okay, the difference between doing that in a breathwork experience and doing that in an LSD experience is really one of being in control of where you navigate yourself. Because in the breathwork experience, you can slow down, you can control it to some extent.
Right. Yeah.
You don't necessarily want to be talking to all the monsters that you meet in the psychedelic experience. And not to get too deep into maybe some of the more metaphysical / quasi supernatural aspects of this, but we also don't know what we're fucking with at all.
Right. Yeah.
Like, whether it's breathwork or anything, like, we still don't really have a line on this thing called consciousness. And my hunch is that if there are infinite dimensions, consciousness would seem to be like our time machine to all of them. And if we can access these different places, and that means they can access us. And if some of them we don't necessarily want to access, and that's why the role of a shaman is arguably really important, depending on kind of what your beliefs are. I have a friend who is he's kind of a James Randi fan, and major skeptic, and thinks, hey, well, I'll make ayahuasca in my basement and I'll make it work, kind of guy. Look, I think that it is what it is. He is obviously somebody that believes all the kind of spiritual pretensions of whether it be shaman or whoever else, in terms of when they're discussing different entities, is a bunch of hokum. And he kind of lives by that belief, by going out of his way to be able to be iconoclastic about it. But I think that science may eventually kind of vindicate this notion of infinite dimensions that are sort of stacked on top of one another, and that consciousness can access all of these via what we call the imagination, and that the psychedelic experience is really are becoming aware of that system of interdimensionality.
So, Brett, I have some friends, and they're involved in esoteric occult type stuff and psychedelics and shamanic context, but outside of that world, in like a breathwork context or in like a psychotherapeutic context, or even just pure research, like university or hospital research, like in those settings, I don't usually hear much about external entities really hanging around for more than a day or two. Like the sense of an external entity hanging out for like, more than a few days after the experience. But in the esoteric occult world, people will talk about it being a problem for potentially years if you don't do things properly. So is it more that we're going into the situation with a particular context that allows that possibility, or is there actually like risk? Like I haven't heard stories. That's why I'm kind of asking.
I don't think it's a risk that like you need to put on the LSD warning label or something. but I think that part of the problem is that people don't know what they're fucking with. There isn't really a good framework for dealing with this idea of infinite possibilities. So
you don't think the breathwork like workflow or like the Stanger-Groff LSD psychotherapy approach that's not like adequate to handle it, or is it just not sophisticated enough to handle all the possibilities?
It's certainly not a mainstream framework.
Absolutely.
And second of all, I think that there's portions of Groff's work that tend to turn people off because they tend to be dogmatic. I feel in terms of some of the phenomena that they pay really close attention to. I mean, I'm mainly talking about like the neonatal stuff.
Sure.
I feel like Groff's work is incredibly important, and Groff's work is testament to that. But like Freud, some of his ideas have kind of become fossilized in a way, and
what ones?
While they were important, I think that like for me, for example, I think that the attention on birthing is interesting. It's based on kind of like an unprovable hypothesis, and which isn't to say that it is invalid. I think that there is phenomena and anecdotal evidence for the connection between birth and later trauma. I just feel that that portion of his thought has kind of taken center stage at some points, whereas it really didn't have to. Its emphasis kind of reminds me of like the emphasis that maybe like Freud had on sort of identifying like the architecture of the ego or whatever. It was almost it got to the point where it was no longer kind of useful conceptually and started to sort of become like almost mechanical. It won't make any sense. I think I know what you're saying. I'm not an expert in Groff's work. I'm just going based upon like my personal reaction to some of Groff's work. I think sometimes the theory can get in the way of the actual treatment, and that's when, for me, it's no longer useful.
Right. Yeah. I was at a workshop, and there was this person there that, quote unquote, was like, said, I'm a breathwork whore. Like, I just want to relive my birth experience. And, I think the perinatal stuff does have its importance, and I've definitely experienced a lot of perinatal stuff during breath work and this and that. But I view it more as like a map to navigate through. If it comes up, the map's there. It's helpful to go back to and look at it. But yeah, I think some people do become pretty like dogmatic about it when after hearing that. It's just like, I know there's something in my birth that I just want to revisit and relive. Like, I want to relive like that BPM2 experience. And I mean, maybe that's really not what you need to process right now, and you don't need to visit it. And yeah, I think some people do kind of take that, run with it, and they want to like really have that type of experience, because it is saying, well, if you do process it and you relive it, you're gonna come through on the other side and shake off whatever you're holding in your body and move through and heal.
Right. It's almost like the same thing as saying, oh, well, just drink ayahuasca and you'll purge out all, the problems that you have. Right?
Yeah, drink ayahuasca once and your life will be perfect.
Right. It's not a
panacea. It's a particular useful, like, conceptual framework, and it's one component of many, many components.
Right. Exactly. And
the concept is that it was just that Freud and Jung were kind of like, this thing. They had this particular map of what the psyche was, and Groff helped to expand that. It's not to say that the cartography of the psyche won't be expanded further in time. It's just, this is Groff's map. And again, the map is not the territory as we should know.
Exactly. And I certainly don't blame Groff for it. I really respect Groff, and I'm glad that he exists, and I'm glad that it's working out there. So I guess I blame commercialism, really, because it seems like as these things become prone to marketing, everything seems to be nothing is nothing seems to be immune from marketing.
And or fetishization. I think also what you're hinting at is people are fetishizing a particular thing when it's. It should just be like, stuff you read a while ago.
Well, it strikes me. I mean, it certainly happens the other way too. I remember a conversation with a psychology professor, Yale trained, and she was saying, "Oh, well, Freud is full of shit. And, there is no ego in the brain. There's just like neurons and synapses." And I just was thinking to myself, man, this person needs like a class in phenomenology. That's the problem. Like, we want to, we're confusing a concept that's useful with, matter. We're going after like the mechanics of the matter of these things, rather than like asking like, what the usefulness is of them. Ego is an important and useful metaphor for phenomena that we experience as human beings. And people can also obviously, I feel like, take the word ego and make it, mean whatever they want. They can bastardize it and exploit it in ways that I would. But in terms of its contribution, I think it is interesting, and I also don't think it was especially novel. It was just that it was a term that became a popular concept, and of course, people take popular concepts and then they have to create a dogma around it, and as soon as the dogma happens, then really the idea stopped being useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. We definitely get caught up on certain things and just hold on tight.
Yeah, you can see it in every arena for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, language itself it does that, and you know, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. I mean, as long as there's been language, pretty much there's been this kind of uneasy relationship between the sign and the signified, and we're still wrestling with it, and I wish that we would get over it already and realize that the map is not territory, but it seems to be a realization that actually comes with the psychedelic territory.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and that's one of the reasons why I think that people should have psychedelic experiences. Not that it will solve all their problems, but it will give them an understanding which will allow them to build on the tools that they have, problems as they arise. It's about solving all of our problems. It's about being able to cope with them and in a way that allows us to function and make the world better.
Yeah, I had my near-death experience. That's all I like wish for. Is like, man, I wish people could just like have an experience like this. Obviously not dying, but just like the psychological and psychospiritual aspect of that just to open up. Because, you know, after coming back, I just realized like all these maps that we've made, like just they don't make sense sometimes. And you know, after my first experience with psilocybin, I mean, I was like, oh my God, this is so similar to what I experienced when I was dying. Like there are these tools that are here in nature that can allow that, which I think is kind of interesting. Yeah, I think one question that I wanted to ask was, you know, just like what do you see the like the future of Symposium, or just, you know, I just think about the envisioning the post-prohibition world and that. So like, you know, how are you taking the Symposium, and, you know, what do you think about the future of all this stuff and psychedelics in general?
Well, correcting but it's Symposia.
Did I say Symposium?
Yeah, like multiple times.
I know it's Symposium. I don't
matter.
know why.
Maybe we should have called it the company Symposium. I don't know.
It just rolls up
right now. Well, it's Symposia. It's too late to rebrand. Well, so I think that the future of Symposia is well, that's a broad question. I mean, I hope that I would like to have like kind of the honesty of Vice with kind of the let's say the like with class, you know, like with the class of like the BBC. You know, I want to keep up like temerity with like warmth and humility, and it's kind of a tough combination. I don't remember ever seeing it really. Maybe like actually like, you know, back in, you know, like the old news guys or whatever. I think some of them had it. You know, Bill Moyers and. So I guess the future of Symposia, I hope, is that our brand will continue to grow, and as we grow, so will the appetite that a lot of people have for really just like honest, warm, compassionate communication and content on issues pertaining to transformation.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to see how everything starts growing in the near future. It's been fun to, meet you guys at the beginning at Horizons and just watch you guys do your thing over the past few years. It's been so cool to see all the events that you're putting on. And, I just sit here in Vermont rooting for you, not being able to attend everything, but, it's really awesome to see you guys just take it and run with it, and you're growing it. You're getting the word out there, and you guys are doing awesome work.
Well, thank you so much, man. Yeah, it's been great having you as a friend, and having you there rooting for us and being a part of it when you can. And yeah, I mean, it's been a wild ride, for sure. And it seems like it's just going to get crazier.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I'm also excited. I really look forward to going to some of your events and seeing how it develops. I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to meet you if you do make it out to Boulder for an event in Colorado eventually.
Yeah, that would be great. And you're of course welcome. And I'd love to have you even maybe doing like a live podcast or if that's something that you'd be interested in.
That would be fun. We could do something on stage.
Yeah. I feel really hopeful right now about things, and well, not about things, about our thing. The world may be quickly going to hell, but maybe by the time it finally combusts, we have things right with our scene. I don't know. It's a race against time, I guess. But it's definitely an exciting time to be doing what we're doing, and I can't imagine a group that I connect more to than the people in this subculture.
Yeah, likewise. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and I totally appreciate your time, and looking forward to talking to you again. That's it for today's episode of Psychedelics Today. That was Brett Greene with Psymposia. Thanks for listening, and if you want more information, check us out at psychedelicstoday.com. Thanks. Bye.